All right, Crim 4, Chapter 4, Law Enforcement and the Citizen on the Street. Okay, here we go. All right. Under the Fourth Amendment, there are three distinct levels of interaction between the police and an individual on the streets. Consensual contacts, or encounters, but I call them consensual contacts. Most contacts that law enforcement officials have with people are going to be consensual. They're going to walk up and down the streets, contact people, ask them how they're doing, that kind of stuff. And most of their contacts are not going to involve either detentions or arrests. But detentions are different from arrests. You're kind of probably looking at these saying, well, why would we have two different things? Detentions are short-term seizures of custody. So if someone is detained, they're typically detained for a short period of time only so that the officers can investigate something. Okay, so detentions are different than consensual encounters, and they're also different from arrests. Now, an arrest is typically that a person is being taken into custody because they have committed a law violation, or the officer believes that person has committed that law violation. Before an officer may effect a lawful detention, the officer needs to possess reasonable suspicion. So we talked about probable cause. Reasonable suspicion is a lower level of sorry, I went on pause there and I have forgotten where I was, but I know we were talking about reasonable suspicion versus probable cause as far as detention is concerned. So let me give you an example of when an officer would use the whole concept of that detention as opposed to arrest. So say an officer gets a call of a person laying on the ground. Let's say a teacher in a classroom laying on the ground, and the teacher has suffered from numerous gunshot wounds, and the classroom is full of students. It would be reasonable that the officer would detain every student in that classroom in order to investigate, to figure out who actually shot the teacher. Make sense? So that's a kind of typically a shorter period of time where a person is detained but not necessarily arrested. So there's, like I said, difference between the two. Terry versus Ohio. This is a case where there was a string of robberies that had taken place, and an officer was undercover in the neighborhood where these robberies had taken place, and while he was undercover, he noticed a couple of guys that were walking back and forth, as he described it, in a suspicious manner, back and forth in front of like a pawn shop or jewelry store type of place. And he watched and watched and watched, and then finally approached the suspects. In his mind, they were suspects, and patted them down to make sure that they did not have weapons on them in their possession. And turns out one of them did. So they went to court, and the Terry, who is the guy that had a gun in his possession, said that he didn't have reasonable suspicion to stop him, or probable cause to stop him and say, I'm sorry, he didn't have probable cause, not reasonable suspicion. He did not have probable cause to stop him, so he shouldn't have stopped him and patted him down for weapons. And the courts said that a short detention, or a stop and frisk, as we call it, to check for weapons only, would just require reasonable suspicion. This is a lower level of suspicion than probable cause. There's not an actual test, so ultimately, it's up to the judge to decide what is reasonable suspicion. I know, back to the same word, Reasonable and justice. Reasonable and justice. Those are the two words that we're going to talk about a lot in this class that get very complicated and confusing and muddy. Okay, so Terry versus Ohio, that was that case, but the court ruled that it was okay because of the totality of the circumstances. The officer who stopped him had 25 years of experience. There had been robberies in the area. They had been acting suspicious. It was the type of business that appeared to be ripe for a robbery. So, yeah, those stops are typically short. A Terry stop, Terry type detention, stop and frisk. The officer can only pat them down for weapons. Only pat them down for weapons. Now, typically, if we were in class together, we would do a little demonstration where I would put a Ziploc bag with sugar in my pocket, and I would have someone pat me down for weapons and see if they could, tried to alert on the sugar in my pocket. And even if you did find sugar in my pocket, there's a problem there, because would you confuse a Ziploc bag with sugar in it for a weapon, for a gun or a knife? Yeah, probably not. So, anyways, it is for officer safety only, looking for weapons, and it is temporary. That is a Terry stop. Yeah. What is reasonable suspicion? We still don't have a definition for it, based on specific facts that have to be articulated in court. Seems ridiculous, doesn't it? So New York City has come under a lot of criticism for their use of this whole stop and frisk. A lot of people in the city of New York believe that officers were biased and were using racial profiling when using stop and frisk. So they did stop using stop and frisk for a while in New York. I believe they are, again, using stop and frisk, but it is legal. The Supreme Court has ruled that stop and frisk is legal. There we go. Okay, so we already kind of talked about the New York City and the kind of the backlash that the NYPD got from stop and frisk is kind of why. What's next? Sobriety checkpoints. These are always things that people are kind of like, how the heck is that legal? And I kind of understand that. But the Supreme Court has basically decided that because the risk of DUI deaths is so significant, it was worth kind of the intrusion on drivers to allow for DUI checkpoints. So DUI checkpoints with very strict rules in place are legal. And you've probably seen them on numerous occasions. They're all over. You'll see a lot of people that will consider trying to kind of get away from them. And trying to get away just makes them follow you. So, but yeah, sobriety checkpoints are legal. But there are very specific things that have to happen, and they are listed in your book on page 102. The checkpoint must meet the reasonableness standard under the Fourth Amendment. There must be a neutral application of the screening process. So they have to make a decision. They're going to do every other car or every third car. They're going to stop every fifth car, whatever it is. They can't just randomly say, okay, I don't like the way that guy's hair is, so I'm going to pull him over. There must be limits on the discretion of the officers. Checkpoint must be located at a reasonable location. What does that mean? Reasonable, I know. Law enforcement officials are expected to use good judgment in the times and places where they put those, and advanced publicity is required. You guys probably don't read an actual hard copy newspaper anymore because nobody does. But in the Fresno Bee, I remember there's a section where all the DUI checkpoints would go. So you can look on the Fresno Police Department's website, and you will see where the sobriety checkpoints will be at what time on what days. So, and that is required by law. Interesting. I know. Canine sniffing. Another warrantless canine search is performed around your vehicle. If that's done, it's legal. Use of canines for, if you've been, I was in an airport not too long ago where they had us walk 2 by 2 with a canine in between us for, I don't know, maybe 20 yards, maybe 30 yards. It was really interesting because normally you just see the canines walk through the group of people, but a dog alerting, a trained canine alerting on a person or a thing is considered probable cause. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true, and it's really interesting. Warrantless sniffs at airports are legal. If a warrantless sniff at a mall could be legal. The canine alerts are very powerful. So these are things to consider. My good friend of mine is the probation officer who has a drug sniffing canine for the Fresno County Probation Department. And listening to his presentations he's done for some of my classes before, it's really interesting the things that you can learn about how much those dogs can do. They're unbelievable, but really cool. But they also are very powerful in that they can be considered probable cause. Now, we cannot have a canine go sniff someone's front door and say, oh, we're going to search that house. That's not going to happen. And also, one of the big problems with the canines in the area, there aren't that many. I mean, we have a lot, but a lot of those are apprehension dogs. So the canines that are drug sniffing dogs, there aren't enough of them. So a lot of times, an officer will be pulled over with somebody on 99, and they can't get a canine out there for 45 minutes. You can't really leave a person standing out there waiting for the canine for 45 minutes. And I think that typically kind of the guideline they've used is about 20 minutes is how long they can ask a citizen to wait. But any more than that, yeah, it's probably not going to be legal. So there are some issues with it. Cell phone sniffing dogs. You can also teach these dogs to sniff for many different things, and basically anything. What they were doing with the cell phone sniffing dogs was having them alert to the batteries, lithium batteries. So the dogs would alert to the lithium batteries. Other dogs who were trained to alert for drugs, illegal drugs, would alert on money, because I think a lot of people probably know that people's money and drugs tend to go hand in hand and have contact with each other a lot. So really interesting. If you ever get some time to research these canines, it's very, very interesting. Okay, so we talked about Terry versus Ohio, talked about stop and frisk, which is a Terry stop based on the Terry versus Ohio weapons only. We talked about the Terry stops or stop and frisk being really controversial in New York, and talked about canines and how they can help assist in law enforcement searches. Okay, whew, we made it.